There are things that famous people carry privately for their entire lives, things that shape every decision they make and every value they hold, that their audience never fully sees because the public version of a person and the private version rarely occupy the same space. Roy Rogers was one of the most recognized faces in the history of American entertainment, a man whose image was so thoroughly associated with decency, warmth, and moral clarity that he became less a person over time and more a symbol of something the country wanted to believe about itself. Children who grew up watching him in the 1940s and 1950s did not think of him as an actor playing a role. They thought of him as someone real, someone whose goodness extended beyond the screen into the actual texture of daily life. That perception was not entirely wrong. But it was incomplete in ways that the public record only began to fully reveal decades after his death. What his adopted daughter Mimi eventually confirmed, more than 20 years after Roy Rogers died, reframed the entire story of who he was and what drove him in ways that made the legend feel simultaneously smaller and considerably more meaningful than it had been before. Roy Rogers was born Leonard Franklin Sly on November 5, 1911, in Cincinnati, Ohio, according to his documented biography. His early life carried none of the markers that conventionally predict fame. He did not come from a family with connections to show business or the arts. He grew up in modest rural circumstances in Ohio and later in Portsmouth, where the Depression-era economy produced the kind of daily financial pressure that most Americans of his generation understood intimately. During the Depression, he moved to California and spent time working as a migrant fruit picker in the San Joaquin Valley, one of hundreds of thousands of Americans displaced by economic collapse who ended up in California looking for work that was itself uncertain and poorly paid. In the evenings, according to multiple biographical accounts, he would play guitar around campfires after the day's labor was finished, and he discovered there that music could do something for people that nothing else in those circumstances quite could. He eventually formed a singing group called the Pioneer Trio, which later became the Sons of the Pioneers, and the recording of Tumbling Tumbleweeds caught the attention of Hollywood in ways that nothing in his background had suggested was coming. Republic Pictures signed him in 1937 and gave him a new name, Roy Rogers, borrowing the surname from the recently passed American humorist and entertainer Will Rogers in the belief that the association would resonate with audiences. According to his Wikipedia biography, from 1943 onward the Motion Picture Herald named him the #1 money-making Western star, a ranking he held for 12 consecutive years. He and his co-star Dale Evans made 88 films together that were seen by an estimated 80 million people annually during the 1940s. His horse Trigger, his dog Bullet, and his Jeep Nellie Bell were not simply supporting elements of his films but fixtures of a fully realized world that children across America incorporated into their imaginations with a consistency and devotion that studios today spend hundreds of millions of dollars trying to replicate through franchise building. He is the only person elected twice to the Country Music Hall of Fame, first in 1980 as a member of the Sons of the Pioneers and again in 1988 as an individual, according to the Hall of Fame's documented records. Dale Evans was born Frances Octavia Smith on October 31, 1912, in Uvalde, Texas, according to her Wikipedia biography. Her early life contained complications that the polished queen of the West image she eventually inhabited did not advertise. She married young, had a son named Tom, and kept that son's existence concealed from the public for years when her entertainment career began, having concluded that being known as a mother would damage her marketability as a young actress. It was a secret she carried with considerable guilt for a long time, and speaking about it publicly much later became part of how she understood her own capacity for honesty and self-deception. She and Rogers first worked together on the 1944 film The Cowboy and the Senorita. Their professional chemistry was evident immediately, and what developed between them in the years that followed was both a creative partnership of unusual depth and a personal relationship that would outlast almost everything else in both of their lives. Rogers had been married before. His first wife, Arlene, whom he had married in 1936, died in 1946 after giving birth to their son Roy Jr., known as Dusty. The loss was devastating by any account, and within a year Rogers had married Dale Evans, a decision that some people in his circle considered premature but which would prove to be one of the most enduring marriages Hollywood ever produced. They married on New Year's Eve, 1947. The marriage lasted more than 50 years, until Roy's death in 1996. In an industry where marriages often collapse within years of their beginning, the durability of their partnership across half a century reflects something real about the nature of what they had built together, both professionally and privately. Together they brought a visible Christian faith into their public work and their personal conduct in ways that were not fashionable in Hollywood at the time, and that exposed them to the kind of criticism that always attaches to public figures who make their beliefs explicit. They appeared at Billy Graham crusades across the country, spoke openly about their religious convictions in interviews, and presented themselves consistently as people whose values extended beyond their professional roles. That faith would be tested, repeatedly and severely, by losses that no amount of fame or professional success could mitigate or make comprehensible. In 1950, Dale Evans gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Robin Elizabeth Rogers. She was the only biological child born of their marriage, and from the moment she arrived she came with medical realities that would have challenged any family in any era. Robin was born with Down syndrome. In 1950, the medical and cultural understanding of Down syndrome bore almost no resemblance to contemporary knowledge. Doctors routinely advised parents of children born with the condition to institutionalize them, to remove them from family life and from public view, operating from a framework that treated developmental disability as something to be hidden rather than accommodated. The prevailing wisdom of the era was that these children were best kept away from ordinary social environments, and most families of that period, operating under enormous professional and cultural pressure, followed that guidance. Roy and Dale refused. According to accounts documented across multiple biographical sources, including Dale Evans's own writing, all the medical professionals who treated Robin advised Roy and Dale to institutionalize her, and they declined completely. More significantly, according to the same sources, they insisted that every family publicity photograph include Robin, at a time when their studio was genuinely concerned that images of a child with a disability would alienate their audience. Read that again in its full context. In 1950, at the peak of their celebrity, Roy Rogers and Dale Evans insisted that their daughter with Down syndrome be present in every public family image, actively pushing back against the advice of Republic Pictures and against the medical establishment's recommendations simultaneously. It was a quiet act of genuine courage, carried out without public announcement or self-congratulation, that most people who consider themselves fans of Roy Rogers have never fully appreciated. Robin lived for just under 2 years. She died in August 1952, shortly before her second birthday, from complications related to mumps. The grief was immeasurable by any standard, and it arrived at a moment when the couple was at the center of one of the most intensely public entertainment careers in America. Dale Evans responded to that grief by writing, sitting down and producing a short book narrated from Robin's perspective, as if the child herself were telling the story of her brief life from heaven. She titled it Angel Unaware. It was published in 1953 and became a bestseller, reaching parents who were raising children with disabilities in an era when the cultural message they received consistently was one of shame and concealment. According to multiple sources documenting its impact, Angel Unaware provided something those parents desperately needed, which was a framework for understanding their children's lives as possessing meaning, worth, and dignity rather than representing a failure or a burden. The book's influence extended beyond individual families. According to documented accounts of its legacy, Evans became influential in shifting public perceptions of children with developmental disabilities, and an organization then known as the Oklahoma County Council for Mentally Retarded Children adopted the name the Dale Rogers Training Center in her honor. Robin's death changed the Rogers family permanently and in ways that would only become fully visible years later. The connection between that loss and what came next is the piece of the story that Mimi eventually confirmed, and it is the piece that reframes everything else about who Roy Rogers was as a private person. Marion Rogers, known as Mimi, was born in Scotland during the Second World War. Her early childhood was defined by instability and loss of the most fundamental kind. She spent a significant portion of her childhood in an orphanage, years of institutional life in wartime and post-war Scotland that provided physical care without the permanence and individual attention that constitute a family. She had no stable home, no certainty about her future, and no particular reason to expect that her circumstances would change dramatically. In 1954, when Mimi was 13 years old, everything changed. Roy Rogers and Dale Evans adopted her, bringing her from Scotland to California and into a household that was, from the outside, about as far from a Scottish orphanage as it was possible to imagine. Mimi has spoken in interviews about the dimensions of that transition, about the culture shock of suddenly finding herself the daughter of the most famous cowboy in America, about the strangeness of moving from institutional care in post-war Scotland into the world of Hollywood's most iconic family. But what she has consistently returned to in those accounts is not the fame or the glamour or the strangeness of the external circumstances. It is something much simpler. Inside the house, she has said, Roy and Dale were not celebrities. They were not America's cowboy and his queen. They were mom and dad. The warmth was real, and Mimi, who had spent years without any of it, was positioned by her own experience to recognize its value in a way that perhaps only someone who had genuinely been without it could fully understand. What Mimi has also confirmed, directly and without ambiguity, is something that explains why any of this happened in the first place. She believes, and has stated clearly, that the reason Roy and Dale came to adopt her was connected to Robin. That the loss of their biological daughter created a space in their family and in their hearts that they chose to fill by opening their home to children who had no family of their own. She has said that she probably owes her presence in America, her entire life as it ultimately unfolded, to Robin. To a little girl who lived less than 2 years and who never knew that her existence would send consequences across an ocean and into a Scottish orphanage more than 2 years after her death. That is an extraordinary thing to sit with and consider fully. Robin never met Mimi. Robin did not live long enough to meet anyone outside her immediate family. But the way Roy and Dale responded to her death, the openness and the expansion of love rather than the contraction into grief and withdrawal that would have been entirely understandable, is the direct chain of causation that brought Mimi from Scotland to California and gave her the life she would go on to live. One child's brief existence, honored by 2 parents who refused to be diminished by losing her, created the conditions for another child's rescue from an orphanage on the other side of the world. Roy and Dale did not stop with Mimi. According to his documented biography, together they opened their home to several additional children, including Dodie, a Native American infant adopted at 7 months old, as well as Sandy and Debbie. Roy was already the father of children from his first marriage, and the family he and Dale built together ultimately included 9 children. The Rogers household became something genuinely unusual for its era, a blended, multiracial family constructed deliberately by 2 people who had experienced profound loss and responded by making more room rather than less. The family was not finished being tested by tragedy. Their adopted daughter Debbie was killed in 1964 at the age of 12 when the church bus she was traveling in was involved in an accident. Their adopted son Sandy died the following year at 18 years old while serving in the army in Germany, after a night of heavy drinking. 2 children in consecutive years, following the earlier loss of Robin. To lose 3 children across the span of a life, while maintaining a public career built around warmth and hope and the projection of values to millions of fans who look to you as a model of how a good person behaves, is a weight that defies any adequate description. Roy and Dale kept going. They did not collapse publicly. They did not retreat into bitterness or withdraw from the work of family life. Dale continued to write, turning private grief into public witness in ways that gave language and comfort to other parents carrying similar losses without the resources or the platform to process them publicly. Roy Rogers died on July 6, 1996, at the age of 86, from congestive heart failure, according to his documented biography. President Clinton expressed condolences publicly. The Country Music Hall of Fame marked the loss. Fans across the country who had grown up with him felt something genuine in their response, a personal grief connected to the specific quality of what he had represented to them during their childhoods. Dale Evans survived him and passed away in 2001. With their deaths, the more private dimensions of their family story receded further from public awareness. The surviving children continued their lives largely outside the spotlight. The Roy Rogers and Dale Evans Museum in Branson, Missouri, which Dusty had been involved in operating, closed in 2009. And Mimi, the girl from Scotland who had been brought across an ocean by 2 people responding to the loss of a daughter they would never stop grieving, eventually decided that the story deserved to be told fully. Not for publicity or any visible strategic purpose. Simply because the people involved deserved to be remembered as they actually were, not as the simplified icons that fame inevitably produces, but as human beings who had experienced real suffering and responded to it in ways that changed other people's lives in ways those other people never fully understood until they had the distance of decades to look back across. What Mimi confirmed is not a complicated truth. It is a simple one that the complexity of grief and family and adoption and faith and loss had kept partially obscured for a long time. Robin's short life was not a tragedy that the Rogers family overcame on the way to something better. It was the thing that shaped who they became and who they chose to include in their lives afterward. The cowboy in the white hat that 80 million people watched every year during the 1940s was also the man who refused to hide his daughter with Down syndrome from public photographs, who lost 3 children across his lifetime, and who responded to each loss by finding ways to make room for more love rather than less of it. That is the real story. And Mimi, speaking it plainly across the distance of more than half a century, gave it the clarity it always deserved.